Tensions are rising in Ukraine as Russia continues to ramp up its military force on the border between the two countries. Jonah Fisher from our partners at the BBC is in eastern Ukraine with the latest.
These trenches are the Ukrainian military's frontline positions in eastern Ukraine. Now, the Russian-backed forces are about 100 meters or so away from here. We could actually hear them a little bit earlier chopping wood to burn on their fires to keep warm. Now, this conflict line has been pretty quiet for the last few years. It's hardly moved on the ground, but the mood here has significantly shifted over the last few weeks, and the big reason for that is that Russia has deployed a large amount of both personnel and equipment on the Russian side of its border with Ukraine, and that has triggered fears, concerns here in Ukraine that this war, which has been pretty quiet for the last several years, may be about to enter a new phase. Possibly even that Russia might be considering some sort of invasion. Russia, for its part, has played it all down, said it is perfectly entitled to move its troops where it wishes within its own country, and that its redeployment towards the Ukrainian border is part of a military exercise, and that there is nothing more sinister afoot. But the shift, both in terms of the troops and in terms of what's happening on the ground, has certainly got people here worried. And I think a lot of people are asking the question of what exactly is Russia up to? What exactly is it trying to achieve here?
Emergency talks in Paris, an effort to de-escalate a military situation with Russia that many Ukrainians fear could spiral into war. Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel joined her French and Ukrainian counterparts online. Russia's recent deployment of what's estimated to be 100,000 troops, along with heavy weaponry, to its borders with Ukraine has caused alarm across Europe and among NATO allies.
We have so warm and strong relations between Ukraine and France and then Germany. But I said very directly and very honestly that we need now to move very quick. Sorry, I understand that it's our problem, but I think that it's not only our problem, that is the safety of Europe.
Russia, the fourth member of the so-called Normandy format that has, for 7 years, been trying to negotiate a political solution to the conflict in eastern Ukraine, was not invited to the meeting in Paris. Moscow says its troop deployment is a military exercise and poses no threat, but has warned it will respond to what it describes as Ukrainian provocation. 14,000 people have been killed and 1 million forced to flee their homes since the conflict began in 2014. Both sides accuse each other of regularly violating a ceasefire that has barely held since it was signed 7 years ago. Germany and France have been accused of wavering on how to confront Russia and how much support to give Ukraine. Ukraine's foreign minister last week called Russia's troop deployment an open threat of war and destruction of his country. More Ukrainian soldiers have been killed since the beginning of this year than throughout 2020. In Kiev, Ukraine's deputy foreign minister told Al Jazeera Russia is using the threat of violence to test NATO and the new US administration.
Is Russia ready to settle the conflict? That is the question, and the basic one. It's not about us or occupied territories, it's about Russia. Russia is not interested in having result-oriented approaches in these negotiations. They are only pushing for the process by itself to control the situation.
People in the Ukrainian capital are nervous.
Anything could happen. You can expect anything from Putin. If there is a war, everyone will defend our land. We will all be defending our country.
I'm
not a fortune teller, but of course I don't want war. Everything is possible from Russia. It's the aggressor. They're capable of anything, and nothing good will come of it.
Ukraine's president says he is ready to hold talks with Russia, France and Germany in order to calm the situation on the border. In a statement released after the Paris meeting, France and Germany yet again urged Russia to withdraw its forces. But despite the diplomatic pressure, there is no sign Russian President Vladimir Putin is ready to do that yet.
Another day, another funeral in eastern Ukraine. Russian-backed separatists mourn the death of one of their fighters. They say he was killed by a Ukrainian sniper 7 years after the conflict opposing Russia and Ukraine began.
Не может быть мира без войны, как говорится. Каждый день стрельба, каждый день бойцы рискуют своей жизнью, защищая Родину. Трагические события происходят, как в данный момент.
And as Russia piles up troops in the disputed regions, Ukraine's defense minister has raised new concerns over Moscow's intentions in the annexed Crimean Peninsula.
Crimea's infrastructure is being prepared for potentially storing nuclear weapon. We are concerned about plausible preparations to conduct offensive military operation by regular Russian forces from the Crimean direction in order to ensure water supply to the peninsula.
Russia, meanwhile, says the military build-up is all part of a series of exercises set to wrap up in 2 weeks' time, a response to what it calls threatening behaviour from NATO. But could this be Putin's way of putting the new US president to the test? Joe Biden had vowed to take a harsh stance over Russia and labelled Vladimir Putin a killer just last month. But the deployment of US warships in the Black Sea has now been called off, a day after Biden proposed to meet with Putin, suggesting they organise a summit in a neutral country to try and ease tensions in the region.
Now, the US president's called for dialogue with the Kremlin after signing off on new sanctions against Russia. The broad sanctions are to punish Russia for interfering in last year's US election and orchestrating cyber attacks and other hostile acts. Moscow denies the accusations and says it will respond in kind.
Now is the time to de-escalate. The way forward is through thoughtful dialogue and diplomatic process. The U.S. is prepared to continue constructively to move toward that process. My bottom line is this: where there's an interest in the United States to work with Russia, we should and we will. Where Russia seeks to violate the interests of the United States, we will respond.
The Russian government says its response to US sanctions is tit for tat. 10 US diplomats will have to leave and 8 senior current and former administration officials are banned from entering Russia. That includes former National Security Advisor Susan Rice. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says he could go further still.
If our exchanges of niceties continue, we will ask the Americans to bring the number of their diplomats who deal with bilateral relations with Russia in accordance with the number of our employees working in the embassy and 2 general consulates in the US.
The Kremlin is reacting to a US government decision to blacklist Russian companies, expel Russian diplomats and bar US banks from buying sovereign bonds from the central bank in Moscow.
Russia continues to interfere with our democracy.
All this because Washington says Russia is involved in malign acts, including the persecution of opposition politician Alexei Navalny, interfering in elections, engaging in cyber hacking, as well as occupying Crimea. They're the toughest sanctions since 2018.
The government is frightened by the way the events are developing, but they won't change course and will continue to be confrontational. But the question is, how far will the Kremlin push it? They will try to make it look as though nothing has changed, but in reality they will be much more careful in weighing the consequences of their actions.
The Kremlin says President Putin has yet to decide if he'll take part in a US-led climate summit next week. Russia's government seems to be hoping that a line has now been drawn after its response to the US sanctions. The Foreign Ministry here says it wants to avoid any further escalation. And Sergei Lavrov says he takes positively Joe Biden's offer of a meeting with Vladimir Putin.
Talk us through in more detail what Russia has announced today.
Yes, we're just getting some more clarity on what Sergei Lavrov said in the last half hour or so, as well as expelling 10 US diplomats. They're also going to sanction 8 US administration officials. Their names will be revealed later. That sort of matches the individuals that the US, the number of individuals sanctioned by the US. Russia also says it's going to close US foundations and NGOs because they are interfering in Russian affairs. We haven't been given the names as yet of the foundations and NGOs specifically that Russia is referring to. They're going to stop the US hiring Russians and other third country nationals from working in its missions here in Moscow. That is because Russia says in our missions in the US, we only hire Russians. Now, for the US here, that could affect everything from drivers and cleaners to analysts and other individuals who maybe work in the US diplomatic missions here in Russia. So that could make life particularly difficult for the Americans here. And they've also threatened to go a bit further. Lavrov said that there are 450 people working in the US missions in Russia and 450 Russians in the US. But 150 of those, Lavrov says, work in the UN mission. So he says if the US goes further in sanctions against Russia, we will ask the US to take another 150 people out. And lastly, Lavrov suggested that the US ambassador here, John Sullivan, should go back to the US for consultations. This is not expelling the US ambassador, but it's suggesting he go back to the US to discuss with his superiors what's happening. That is because Lavrov says their ambassador to Washington, D.C. is currently here in Moscow.
For now, they wait. Soldiers in the vanguard of the Ukrainian army, ready to spring into action. In the distance, a dozen or so kilometers away, lies Russia.
Звісно, що це може перерости в дуже великий конфлікт, оскільки ми знаємо, що дуже багато зараз війська стягнуто Російської Федерації. Ну, готуємося.
Like pictures of a war from a bygone era, these Ukrainian soldiers are manning trenches. Over the last few weeks, Russia has been steadily amassing thousands of its own soldiers along this border. Clashes between Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian rebels happen virtually every day. Landmines litter the landscape. Despite loud backing from Western powers, the troops here say they aren't relying on outside help.
Всі країни, що підтримують, Штати і так далі, на мою думку, дуже сильно на їхню допомогу надіятись не треба. Треба більше спиратися на свої сили. Ну, яка чужа країна захоче відправляти своїх людей, ну, можна сказати, на смерть.
More than 13,000 have been killed in fighting between pro-Russian separatists and the Ukrainian army since 2014. And in a sign of growing tension between Moscow and Kiev, earlier on Saturday, Russian warships were spotted sailing into the Black Sea.
Well, we've been arguing about pronouns here in the United States and wondering why 2x4s now cost $9 a piece. There's real drama unfolding in Europe. Tensions between Ukraine and Russia are the highest they have been in a very long time. And we get some sense that there are political elements, mostly in the Democratic Party, not exclusively though, who would like to see a war in Europe. What is this and how concerned should we be about it? Tulsi Gabbard has paid a lot of attention to this. She's a former member of Congress from the state of Hawaii. We're happy to have her on tonight. Congresswoman, thanks so much for coming on. So is this conflict moving toward war, and are there leaders in this country who would like to see that, do you think?
It is moving in a very dangerous direction, and the question for the American people is, are we willing to go to war with Russia on behalf of Ukraine? And we need to understand that such a war would come at a cost beyond anything that we can really imagine. Because this is not a war that is just, okay, this is going to be something that's happening to someone else, somewhere else on the other side of the world. No, this is something that will directly impact me and you, Tucker, every single one of your viewers, and all of our loved ones. And this is a war that is not a game. It's a war in which there are no winners, because you've got, thousands of nuclear weapons that the United States has aimed towards Russia. Russia has thousands of nuclear weapons aimed towards us that could hit any town or city in America in less than 30 minutes and exact a cost upon every one of us that would result in excruciating death and suffering beyond comprehension. Hundreds of millions of people dying and suffering, seeing their flesh being burned from their bones. This is something that you can't really even imagine, and it's a cost that we will all pay.
Why in the world would we ever contemplate going to war with Russia, honestly?
It is one that we should not do for those very reasons.
Yeah.
If you look at the impacts of what a nuclear war brings, it really brings about the end of the world as we know it. And our leaders should understand this consequence and take it seriously. And this is why President Biden, instead of continuing to escalate tensions and continuing this new Cold War between the United States and Russia, he needs to de-escalate these tensions, kind of, take the heat out of it and actually focus on bringing an end to this new Cold War. Because if he doesn't, then it's not a question of if we go to war with Russia, if this war ends up with a nuclear holocaust. It really is then just a question of when. And if we continue down this path that we are on, it's something that could happen a lot sooner than any of us think.
I'm just amazed by the magnitude of the stories that all of us are missing, including those of us who are paid to follow this stuff, and especially this story. And so I appreciate how you so crisply and wisely assessed that. It's terrifying. Thank you.
Welcome to the Live Hotel in Madagascar's capital, Antananarivo. These days, people check in to do just that, live. It's one of many hotels and schools that are now makeshift hospitals, as Madagascar's fragile health system is buried under thousands of new cases.
On a le virus qui est le variant sud-africain.
We have the virus, which is the South African variant, and the second wave, this variant also triggers more severe reactions, hence the increase of death in Madagascar currently.
Madagascar, a country of 27 million people, had escaped the worst of the pandemic. Since the outbreak began, it has recorded 31,000 cases and 538 deaths. But 4,000 of those cases came this week, more than 800 on Saturday.
We came here yesterday and there were still places available, but now it's almost full.
Earlier this month, Madagascar's president, Andry Rajoelina, reluctantly joined the World Health Organization's COVAX program to procure vaccines. He had fought against them, believing a herbal tonic made from the anti-malarial plant Artemisia was a cure. He dubbed it COVID Organics, and last year ordered the military to deliver it to vulnerable residents. He even exported thousands of doses to more than a dozen African nations. The World Health Organization says there's no proof it's effective. Still, it is in high demand.
So far, medicines are free except when they are out of stock. You have to buy them elsewhere. Medicines are free when they still have stocks available.
For Madagascar, this is new. The fight is on to control the virus in hospitals, hotels, schools, as they wait for vaccines to arrive. Charlotte Bellis, Al Jazeera.
Night burials have become the norm at Sao Paulo's main cemetery, as grave diggers struggle to keep up with bodies piling up. More than a quarter of the world's coronavirus deaths recorded last week were in Brazil, with new variants proving more contagious and dangerous. Health officials are even asking women to delay pregnancies.
At this moment of the pandemic peak, when we see there is a difficult situation in maternity wards, because of the situation that's happening in maternity wards, it should be evaluated like what happened with Zika in 2016. If possible, we recommend delaying pregnancy until a more suitable moment, so you can have your pregnancy in a more peaceful way.
Meanwhile, a new study says coronavirus in Brazil is affecting an alarmingly high number of babies and children, whose death toll could be 3 times more than official estimates. And hospitals are running out of beds and crucial drugs for patients. International aid organizations say the Brazilian government of Jair Bolsonaro, a pandemic denier, is to blame for thousands of avoidable deaths.
this disease needs to be taken seriously by the authorities, is what they say to me. People are desperate, they are mourning, and they need help. There is no national and centrally coordinated, efficient response to this pandemic. Prevention measures, which we have seen working in other contexts, like limiting non-essential movements and activities, wearing masks and promoting physical distancing, and increased hygiene measures, are not implemented this moment in Brazil.
But even in countries with more stringent restrictions in place, new variants are driving major surges and growing dissent. In Colombia's capital, Bogota, where a new total lockdown has been imposed on weekends, small shop owners and street vendors took to the streets in protest.
We go hungry every time we close and go into quarantine. I am a humble worker. I sell juice on the street. That's what I live from. I don't have anyone to help me.
Similar scenes in Argentina, a country reporting the highest number of infections since the start of the pandemic. Parents and children protested outside the presidential palace after President Alberto Fernandez announced schools will be shut again for 2 weeks. With hospitals on the brink of collapse, governments say they have no choice but to impose new stay-at-home orders and other restrictions. And with just a fraction of Latin Americans vaccinated and a shortage in supplies, it will be many more months before things will improve. Alessandro Ampietti, Al Jazeera, Bogota.
Unfortunately, we are seeing the kinds of pictures that we did last year during the peak of the first wave of the coronavirus. Most recently, we have seen pictures of bodies outside the biggest government-run hospital in the city of Raipur, and Raipur's chief medical officer said this is because they don't have enough freezers to keep the bodies. That hospital's intensive care units and oxygen-equipped beds have been at almost full capacity over the past week. Raipur is in the state of Chhattisgarh, which is one of the worst affected at the moment, but these issues in Chhattisgarh are not unique to that state. We have reports of a shortage of medical facilities, of equipment in a number of places, most notably in the worst affected state, Maharashtra, where medical teams which were sent there also said that there is a lack of oxygen supply and even malfunctioning ventilators.
Nuclear terrorism is how an Iranian official described a power blackout at its Natanz nuclear enrichment facility. But it stopped short of blaming any group or country. Sunday's cut in the electrical supply grid caused no casualties or contamination.
Terrorist incident in Natanz. Following the incident at Natanz nuclear facility this morning, the head of the Atomic Energy Department called this a terrorist move and emphasized on the necessity of response by international bodies and the IAEA to this act of nuclear terrorism.
Israeli media claimed it was caused by a cyber attack launched by Israeli security services. Although it quoted unidentified sources, some media outlets have a close relationship with intelligence agencies. Iran is now urging the International Atomic Energy Agency to take action, saying it reserves the right to punish the perpetrators. The development comes at an important time as Iran prepares to step back to the negotiating table in Vienna. Talks about Iran's nuclear agreement started there last week, with indirect talks with the United States. President Joe Biden says he's willing to rescue a deal abandoned 3 years ago by his predecessor, Donald Trump. That is, if Iran comes into compliance with the deal.
In my view, without a doubt, this is definitely not a coincidence. And one thing you need to remember, while it is Israel is the usual suspect in these events over the last few years, one must be mindful there are many opponents in many different corners to the resumption of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, not the least of which is from within Iran itself.
Tehran has been steadily moving away from the terms of the 2015 nuclear deal since the US pulled out. The blackout happened a day after Iran unveiled advanced uranium centrifuges at the facility. But Iran had previously made clear that negotiations in Vienna are on the right track. Laura Bader-Manley, Al Jazeera.
It's a universal one, that's what we call it, universal law.
It's been a grueling school year for 17-year-old Mitchell Gilman. With his basement bedroom serving as his classroom, he admits it's been hard to stay motivated during virtual learning.
It was definitely a challenge, not quite knowing my teachers, the atmosphere of not being in a classroom and sitting inside your house day after day. Half of the fun part of school is going in and socializing with your friends.
His extracurricular activities, like basketball, aren't happening.
My day is a little bit more monotonous, less stuff to do.
And while New York City secondary schools recently reopened, time actually in the classroom is limited. His mother got worried when he started sleeping more and eating less.
Is he really excited about learning? No. He's not in a laboratory. He's not in the hallways. He's not in the cafeteria at school. He's not engaged in school.
No more screen time! That's why parents like her in New York, New Jersey, and Los Angeles are taking school officials to court. In New York, an online campaign raised nearly $25,000 to pay attorney Jim Mermigas to represent them.
Schools are the safest places for children.
He blames teachers' unions, not safety concerns, for ongoing reopening delays, which he says are putting children at risk.
There have been some kids who have committed suicide. The kids are depressed. They want to go back, and it's not only going back to school. They want to engage in their extracurricular activities, whether it's sports or chess club or whatever it may be. They want to go back to normalcy.
A CDC study shows emergency room visits for mental health-related issues among older children rose more than 30% at the height of the pandemic. In response to the lawsuit, New York's mayor argues that almost all city schools, like Mitchell's, are open for in-person learning. But parents point out that most students are only allowed to attend part-time. And even when they're in the classroom, they are online, often learning from a teacher who's at home. Unions point to poor ventilation and overcrowded conditions as safety concerns unique to city schools. As for Mitchell, who attends a public performing arts school, there's more spring in his step since dance instructions resumed. It's the one class he's able to do in person. His family and others are pushing for all classes to be in person by autumn. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, New York.
President Joe Biden is expected to hold a joint news conference with Japan's Prime Minister today, marking his first in-person meeting with an international leader since he took office in January. The conversation will likely involve China as tensions rise in East Asia. Lucy Kraft reports on how some companies and the Japanese government are confronting Beijing's alleged human rights abuses.
It's been a wild ride for apparel brands like H&M, Nike, Gap, and other popular retailers in China. The companies face blowback from consumers after calling out alleged Chinese repression of the country's Uyghur minority in the northwest region of Xinjiang. Our patriotism has been sparked, this man said. People are taking this opportunity to express their love for the nation. Now that they have come here to slander China, then I don't think I will shop at H&M. Based on witness accounts and satellite data, the U.S. and human rights groups say China has engaged in genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, including forced labor, sterilization, and other violence in an ethnic assault that's been compared to Nazi Germany. But when multinational retailers stopped sourcing cotton from Xinjiang, they saw sales in China plunge by as much as 20%, said Shanghai-based market researcher Sean Rain.
American brands are in a rock and a hard place. You know, if they heed American human rights activists, they will face boycotts in China. But if they don't criticize Chinese labor practices, they'll face boycotts in the United States.
Beijing has flooded the zone with a propaganda blitz, portraying life in Xinjiang as idyllic, its minorities happily coexisting under a benevolent government. But independent investigators have never been allowed into what's been described as a hyper-policed surveillance state.
China has been sanctioned for human rights abuses by every major industrialized country, except Japan. But many here are saying Japan's traditional so-called all-talk, no-action diplomacy is no longer sustainable.
Tama University professor Akira Igata said support is growing in parliament for legalizing sanctions against countries like China and Myanmar.
So for human rights, I think it's necessary for Japan to actually show action and put money where their mouth is. If we keep on saying that, look, we are afraid of Chinese retaliation, then Japan is going to end up as a country which cannot say anything against China, and that we cannot do anything against China.
China is Japan's top trading partner, and sanctioning Beijing carries heavy risk. But Tokyo has never been under greater pressure to take a stand.